A great Star Trek Voyager war story was shot down by Rick Berman. Despite its great premise, Rick Berman shot down the original idea for the Star Trek Voyager Season 5 episode Once Upon a Time, forcing the creative team to come up with something new. Voyager Season 5 had a high percentage of impressive episodes, including several that are consistently ranked as some of Voyager's best episodes. Although it rarely gets as much love as some others, Once Upon a Time was important to Season 5, notable for being the first big appearance of Naomi Wildman, Scarlett Palmer's, as Voyager's youngest recurring character. The premise of Once Upon a Time followed Naomi and her experiences in a holodeck program called The Adventures of Flaughter, a program designed to teach children natural science and deductive reasoning. Other members of Voyager's cast of characters also featured prominently, including Neelix, Ethan Phillips, who attempted to distract Naomi to conceal the fact that her mother was missing after an away mission accident. However, the original rejected premise for Once Upon a Time would have featured Neelix and Naomi in a very different situation. Why Rick Berman rejected Star Trek Voyager's Once Upon a Time war premise? The initial premise for Once Upon a Time would have featured the rest of Voyager's crew dealing with a war, while Neelix kept Naomi safe in a fantasy world in the holodeck, something that executive producer Rick Berman shot down for a very specific reason. Speaking with Cinefantastic after the episode aired, Voyager writer Joe Menosky explained Berman's reasoning for why he ultimately rejected the idea, citing conflicts with another Star Trek series that was also currently in production. Read Menosky's full quote below. The other show Berman was concerned about was, of course, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, which had been doing an ongoing storyline about the Dominion War since the end of Season 5. DS9 is famous for its depiction of the Dominion War, and the storyline offered a unique angle that Star Trek had rarely explored. Berman's desire not to oversaturate the franchise with too many war episodes makes sense given that Voyager and DS9 were both on the air, but killing the original premise for Once Upon a Time deprived Voyager of a truly unique episode. Star Trek Voyager's Once Upon a Time almost had a much more unique premise. The original premise of Once Upon a Time would have made the episode much more memorable and possibly unique among its fellow Voyager installments. Writer Michael Taylor described the episode to Cinefantastic, stating the notion initially was much bolder. It was going to be real Alice in Wonderland with Neelix and Naomi in this make-believe world for almost the entire show. While The Adventures of Flaughter was almost an Alice in Wonderland-like world, the idea of Neelix and Naomi both forced to stay in the program would have elevated the plot's intrigue significantly. The concept of Star Trek Voyager's crew using the holodeck to protect Naomi while they dealt with some great battle is truly fascinating, and the contrast between the whimsical fantasy world Neelix and Naomi would have had to deal with while knowing that outside the holodeck, everything could be going horribly wrong for everyone else would likely have kept audiences on the edge of their seat. Ultimately, there's no way to know how Once Upon a Time would have played, but Rick Berman's decision not to give its original premise a chance is disappointing to say the least. Star Trek Voyager was a show that pushed the boundaries of science fiction, featuring a ship stranded far from home and a diverse crew of both Starfleet and Maquis rebels. Throughout its 7-year run, it tackled philosophical, ethical, and cultural questions that resonated with audiences. Yet, for all its storytelling potential, some of the most ambitious ideas never made it to the screen. One such story, a high-stakes war narrative, was pitched by writers, but ultimately shot down by executive producer Rick Berman. Had it been greenlit, it might have dramatically changed the trajectory of Voyager and deepened its exploration of the human condition in times of war. This lost story idea is tied to the character of Captain Janeway, portrayed by Kate Mulgrew, and her struggle with leadership in impossible situations. Throughout the series, Janeway is presented as a steadfast, morally upright captain, someone who balances Starfleet's ideals with the practical necessities of being lost in the Delta Quadrant. However, the proposed war story would have tested her to the breaking point, forcing her to make ethically dubious decisions in the name of survival. The backdrop for the war storyline would have been the conflict with the Kazon, an alien species that Voyager encountered early in the series. The Kazon, often criticized by fans for their somewhat simplistic portrayal, were envisioned as a major adversary in the Delta Quadrant. The proposed arc would have elevated them from mere nuisances to a significant military threat. Instead of episodic skirmishes, the story would have depicted a full-scale war between Voyager and various Kazon factions, with Janeway's ship caught in the middle. The brilliance of this story idea was its potential to explore the darker side of leadership. Unlike previous Star Trek captains who primarily dealt with diplomacy, Janeway would have faced prolonged warfare without the backup of Starfleet, testing the limits of her ideals. The emotional toll of commanding a starship in wartime, with lives lost and resources dwindling, would have been a central theme. The writers envisioned a more realistic portrayal of war, where Janeway would be forced to make sacrifices that might haunt her for the rest of her journey home. It would have blurred the lines between heroism and survival, putting her command style under a microscope. This potential arc would have allowed characters like Chakotay, Tuvok, and even the Doctor to confront the moral implications of Janeway's decisions. How far would they go to follow orders when the outcome seemed increasingly grim? Would Janeway's decisions cause a schism within the crew, particularly among the former Maquis who had already lived through their own war? These tensions could have given the show a sense of urgency, deepening the drama on board and highlighting the personal costs of war. For the Kazon, this storyline could have fleshed them out beyond their somewhat two-dimensional portrayal. The writers could have shown the complexity of Kazon society, exploring their internal divisions and the motivations behind their attacks on Voyager. The war story could have allowed viewers to see the Kazon as more than antagonists, possibly even creating sympathetic characters within their ranks. This would have been a nuanced approach, shifting the traditional Star Trek dynamic of alien enemy versus Starfleet into a more complex narrative about cultural misunderstanding, survival, and desperation. But despite its potential, this story arc never materialized. Rick Berman, who was known for steering the Star Trek franchise toward broader, family-friendly storytelling, was uncomfortable with the concept of a prolonged war storyline. In Berman's vision of Star Trek, violence and warfare were always secondary to diplomacy and exploration, even in difficult situations. He was hesitant to make Voyager too dark, fearing that it would alienate viewers who expected a more optimistic tone from the franchise. The grim realities of war did not fit with the aspirational future that Berman wanted the Star Trek universe to represent. Additionally, the decision to avoid this war arc was likely influenced by Star Trek Deep Space Nine's ongoing Dominion war storyline. DS9 had already taken Star Trek into darker territory with its exploration of war, espionage, and political intrigue. The producers may have felt that having Voyager tackle a similar war theme would be redundant or diminish the distinct identity of each show. With Voyager intended to focus on exploration and survival, they decided to keep it separate from the grittier storytelling that was becoming synonymous with DS9. Instead, Voyager continued with its episodic format, occasionally touching on the difficulties of being stranded, but largely avoiding the sustained examination of war and its impact on the crew. While the show certainly had its share of tense moments and moral dilemmas, the deep character exploration that could have come from the war story was lost. In hindsight, it's easy to see how this rejected war storyline could have elevated Voyager's narrative complexity.